Dr. Thomas Adams is a lecturer in History and American Studies from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Thomas, really good to talk to you tonight.
Good evening.
Barack Obama has condemned the violence that broke out, says there needs to be some soul-searching throughout the nation. What's it going to take for that to happen?
Well, I think, this has kind of been President Obama's reaction since Ferguson, Missouri last year. And I think, to me, kind of the more interesting point going on here is that there's not really a political will within either the Democratic Party or an institutional base in American politics to actually demand any substantive changes. Now, effectually, President Obama could basically order the Justice Department and the new Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, to really kind of do a close investigation of many urban police departments around America that have faced all sorts of accusations of civil rights violations and constitutional rights violations, and move in to really actually direct the federal government to change that. But that being said, I don't see any kind of political process where that would play out.
Thomas, is there the sense in many states in America that there are communities in distress because of this issue?
Oh, absolutely. More than 47 years ago now, following riots in the 1960s and urban unrest in the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson put together a large commission to study the causes of these. And the key classic finding of that commission was that increasingly America is creating two different societies, black and white, separate and unequal. And unfortunately, 47 years later, all the kind of predictions of that commission have very much come true, that in many kind of cities, distressed cities in the Midwest and the Northeast, in particular cities that have faced large-scale deindustrialization and increasing poverty, you see kind of small enclaves of wealthy residences surrounded by kind of massive enclaves of incredibly poor people, lots of poverty, very poor life opportunities, and that's continued to get worse.
Why is it then that if there is high unemployment, poor opportunities, people don't recognise that that is one of the reasons that many of these communities turn to crime and become restless and, in this case, violent? Yeah,
absolutely. And, I think a lot of it... a lot of the more recent coverage of some of these instances of police brutality, for instance, a lot of this is not a new thing, of course. Thinking back to the 1960s, lots of these urban unrests were caused, and frankly, by very similar situations of police brutality. And what's new here in many ways is the kind of quick dissemination through cell phone cameras and things like that. So it's getting out there. But even you can see in the coverage of the events in Baltimore the last few days, the narrative is quickly turned to storefronts being smashed, and has moved away from the focus on the kind of massive problems in the Baltimore Police Department. The Baltimore Sun, the city's major daily newspaper, released a study just less than a year ago the city spending more than $10 million in defending itself and paying out in claims of police brutality only since 2009. And that's only the ones that actually were paid out.
What should police do differently?
Well, this goes to a larger question of the context of all this. And basically, since really the 1960s and 1970s, America has been kind of prosecuting what President Richard Nixon kind of famously called a war on crime, which really led to a heavy militarization of the police in America that was aided by, later on in the 1980s, the growth of the war on drugs. And it's really kind of led to a very us versus them attitude on the part of the police. And that feeling, of course, if you live in one of these poor neighborhoods in the United States, you have that same feeling too, where the police are not seen as people to protect, but as actually people to fear. So I think to actually get at the heart of this issue, America, and again, it's not simply a question, as President Obama says, of soul searching. It's actually a question of putting forth policies that will actually ratchet down the police state of urban America.
Just before we spoke, we saw that mother dragging her young son out of the riots. Is there a responsibility too for the African-American communities to try and do something too to quell this?
Well, for one thing, I think both nationally in America, internationally, to posit a singular thing as an African-American community, I think is actually a problem in itself. There are multiple hundreds of African-American communities out there that do not speak with anything close to one voice. There's a responsibility, certainly on the part of Americans who care about these issues, black, white, Latino, and whatever, to kind of come together and form organizations and institutions that can actually begin to combat these situations. But in terms of if there's actually, responsibility on the part of African-Americans themselves for this, I would say, on the contrary, this is a reaction to, again, the kind of police state of urban America that many Americans are frankly forced to live in.
Yeah, it needs a different approach. Really good to talk. Thanks so much,
Thank you so
Thomas.
much.